Could I just, before the event itself takes place, introduce myself? My name is Philip Dodden. I'm a trustee and director of the China Art Foundation, which along with the Met has organized this talk this evening. We just want to say a few words, if we may, about the foundation. You know, we set it up in 2008, and the logic behind setting up was that the world needed to understand China, and China needed to understand the world, and the best way of doing this was through agencies of civil society, of which, in a very profound way, the China Art Foundation is one.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gary Tinterow, and I'm Engelhardt Chairman of the Department of 19th Century Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a great pleasure to welcome our guests to our stage tonight, two highly distinguished artists, Frank Stella and Wang Yongping, and my colleague, Maxwell Hearn, who is Chairman Designate of the Department of Asian Art, and with me, a longtime curator at this institution, and Mr. Wang's translator, who will assist in rendering his language into English this evening. We've invited Mr. Stella and Mr. Wang to speak about their practice and to muse a bit about the question of all artistic practice, past and present, East and West, to see how artists consider their work in relationship to the work of their immediate predecessors, their predecessors in antiquity and in past practice, as well as their contemporaries. And we have a number of questions to try to stimulate a conversation, but we'll begin first with brief introductions to the work of our two guest artists, Mr. Stella and Mr. Wang. And it's my pleasure to introduce Frank Stella to you and his work. Certainly no stranger to New York or to the Metropolitan Museum. Just a few years ago, we welcomed an exhibition of his work, Frank Stella, Painting into Architecture, that explored this marvelous space that Mr. Stella has investigated between painting and architecture as his work literally exploded off the wall and became freestanding and maybe even habitable. He has had an extraordinary career, one of the longest and most varied careers of any artist I can think of in recent history, but almost always about the same thing, always about the making of works of art and the exploration of forms in 2 or 3 dimensions. And just to quickly remind you of some of his work, he made a dramatic entry into the New York art scene in 1958 and 59 with paintings such as this one called Arbeit macht frei, one of the so-called black paintings, which are what they are, as Frank Stella likes to say. What you see is what you see. It's a painting that began as a set of propositions that on a canvas this size with bands this wide, penciled in, and a brush this way with paint with this quality, you get this result, which is the painting you see here. And like other artists of his generation, he developed art from a practice. I'm going to do this, and we'll see what happens as a result, as opposed to conceiving an image or representing a form or representing reality. The reality was the act of painting, in this case, for Mr. Stella. But this was a dramatic renunciation of the dominant painting practice in New York at this time, which was the gestural abstract expressionism of people like de Kooning or Franz Klein, or even the much more subjective and perhaps emotive work of contemporaries like Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, who were working in New York at that time. Mr. Stella went to Andover as an undergraduate and then Princeton University, and came to New York and began to paint works like this, which brought him immediately to the attention of curators at the Museum of Modern Art, the art dealer Leo Castelli, critics like Michael Fried and Clement Greenberg, and he's had a remarkable career ever since. I think what is so fascinating as an art historian about Mr. Stella's work is how there's an internal logic that seems to inform and almost predict what the next series of works will be. And he did work in series like so many artists have before him. So from the black paintings came aluminum paintings and copper paintings, and then finally moving into colors, such as this work here at the Met called Haines City of 1963. And from making shapes on canvas, he allowed himself to shape the canvas itself so that the canvas was no longer a rectangle, but could assume its own form and also have a depth. In a work like Marrakesh, the next year, he explores color and leaving the minimal and monochrome palette of his earlier works, indulges in a truly joyous and explosive sense and use of color, to a work like Sunapee, where he takes the implications of shaped canvas to a new level, playing with optical illusion and the suggestion of depth and relief, to these protractor series that many of us of my age, were so astounded to see in the 1960s and 1970s as they were acquired by museums and sometimes hung in important public buildings. The shaped canvas no longer began to imply dimension and relief, but could assume relief as well, as in this picture, Yarmolinsky from the Polish Village series. These works were carefully calibrated by Mr. Stella in preliminary drawings and models, and then finally fabricated and colored by him. And from that shaped relief and the sense of dimension and the shadow that the forms could place, his pictures literally began to jump off the wall. Here is a work called Dart, which occupies, again, a strange interstice between painting and sculpture. I guess if one had to define it, it would be a relief. It's a relief that literally grabs you by the lapels and shakes you. And then finally, after the painting is, in a sense, trying to fly off the wall, it decides to stand up by itself in the middle of the room and becomes a paint sculpture, a painting that can stand self-sufficient as a sculpture itself. This is a work of 1994, I think. And to show you, this is a graphic from 1998, how youthful Mr. Stella's work appeared as he grew on in years. He was constantly renewing his imagery, and at this point, exploring the use of digital means of expression to modify images that he would capture and then reconfigure and apply to whatever medium or vehicle he was using. And almost naturally, out of this exploration of form and space came architecture. And increasing, as early as the early 80s, but increasingly in the 90s, Mr. Stella focused his energy and attention and resources on making, at times, monumental architecture, such as this model on the left, and then finally on the right, and actually, as you see with the scale of the figure, a glorious sculpture / building / bandshell that was destined for the city of Miami and I think never installed there.
It never got beyond Cherbourg where it was built.
Yeah.
It's still there. You can
it's
see
still
it.
in Cherbourg?
You can see it. Yeah, you can see it from the ferry.
Town of Cherbourg should buy it from you. And then a view from our exhibition here at the roof to show one of his, Mr. Stella's projected structures that evolved out of a museum project that he had, and again, inhabiting this strange space between painting, sculpture, and architecture. And finally, an indication of the kind of freestanding sculpture without architectural ambition that he's making recently, and which one finds in being acquired by museums around the world. So I'm going to turn over the pointer to Mr. Stella, but before I do, I just want to indicate among his many achievements was this remarkable feat of translating a speeding ticket on the Taconic going 105 miles per hour in a 60 mile per hour zone in a Ferrari into, and a 30-day jail sentence, into 4 hours of art historical lectures. So Mr. Stella, I think, is going to speak to us for about 20 minutes or so, which by my calculation corresponds to about 2.5 days in jail.
Okay. Thank you. Some stories die hard. Okay, what do I do, though? I never did.
Forward.
Okay. Okay. This is obviously the Entombment by Caravaggio, and it's I don't know. It's about as dead center as you can get from my point of view, or from the point of view of someone who was an art student. This is Western art at one of its highest moments. One of the things that interested me so much about this piece, besides it being so readily available in the Vatican Museum in Rome, where it does really look great, is that it made the front page of the New York Times. Now, there aren't many paintings from any era which make the front page of the New York Times, and I know that it was the Met's power that put it there. But nonetheless, it did make the front page of the New York Times, and to me, it was a kind of revelation or a change. I'm working at painting. I have to admit that I'm an artist and that I make art. But the point of this was that it had a kind of power. And it wasn't just that it was on the front page of the New York Times. It had it struck me as something that had projective power. And the projective power is the obvious, that it comes out towards you. And it was able to do that even even in a newspaper reproduction. And the implications of that are myriad, or you can take it almost any way you want. You can worry about what it means to you or to others or how it's seen. But basically, it's a work of art that comes out at you one way or the other, and it engages you, of course, as the audience. But that's not the part that I was really interested in. It's the ability, perhaps in the wrong way, to identify with the person who made it. And it's his business, it's his world, it's his projection, it's his sense of making the painting of his time, changing it in a way, making it come toward the audience, but more or less expressing himself. It's a kind of pictorial expression of sphericality, essentially. I mean, normally you think of Renaissance or even, very early 17th century painting as being expressed in conventional perspectival terms. That's already too far. I've gone with this, so but that's part of the point. We'll go on to the next one. Oop, I'll go back. I did it. This is just another Caravaggio. And people say, oh, you love Caravaggio, you like this kind of painting. Actually, I didn't like Caravaggio at all. And one of the reasons for having a difficulty engaging with Caravaggio was he was such a particular darling of the school that I went to, the art history department of Princeton University, with Bobby Rosenblum and Jim Holderbaum and Fred Licht and Steinberg, the whole gang, as it were. They could have been the Gang of Four or the Gang of Many. But nonetheless, this idea was that Caravaggio was incredibly important, which is true. But from my point of view, it was a kind of threat that this kind of painting was not only powerful, and it came from the past and was present today. Then what did it mean for somebody who didn't have any idea about this painting, had no interest in it, not much interested in the first place, and certainly wasn't going to be able to make anything like that, even if he wanted to? And so it seemed as it's not just that representational painting can be seen as an antithesis, to abstract painting, it's really the power that the painting has. It doesn't matter so much that it happens to be realistic or more powerful. Its power and its sense of realism is attractive to the audience of the world that you have to live in. And people are convinced by the reality or the sense of reality that these paintings project. Now, that didn't mean much to me. I mean, there are a lot of great paintings that look plenty real, and there are a lot of artists for 300 or 400 years that are making very realistic paintings, and there was always, if I can even refer to Chinese art, there are not so much in the paintings would look like this, but there was always the mimetic urge in sculpture and things, and in different ways. So that's always been with us. But the point here is that it happened on this painting by accident in the Capitoline Museum. And walking down the hall and looking at it, I looked at it, and it looked real to me. Actually, it doesn't look so real in this photograph, which is very yellow, but the real painting exudes an obvious sense of physicality and reality. But what did that mean? And I found it easy to accept. I accepted the reality, I accepted that it looked real, but then suddenly I said, so what? What's really real about it? And to me, it's the effort of making the painting. It's the goal of pictorial expression, which was Caravaggio's genius and gift that was able to pull it all together and make this expression convincing to whomever viewed it. But of course, first it had to be convincing to him. And so that was how it became, to me, a simple-minded or simple explanation of mimetic painting and abstract painting having the same goal. They still wanted to express themselves with a pictorial intensity. I certainly overdid that. Next. This won't take so much. This is a landscape painting. And I don't know why I was attracted to it, but it's in Holland, in Maurice's house in Den Haag. And I stumbled on it. I didn't know anything about it, and the only people that heard of Paulus Potter, I guess, were art historians. But this painting is everything looks good on the screen because it's so big. But this is a big painting, and that's a big. Is he a bull? Oh, yes. He's the bull. He's very big. And he takes up the whole picture. And actually, you could say, and I'm not trying to, bang on it. I mean, because there are a million Caravaggio-esque painters. But this is a version, a kind of twist of the kind of Caravaggioism that was prevalent in the 17th century. But it's all turned around. I mean, it's all about the animals and the space. So we don't drag too much, we can see another bull, perhaps. And this is Lascaux. And this is Lascaux on the left and Chauvet on the right. Now, what's the point? And the point is that for me, the artist has to identify himself and a sense of his time and a sense of his work, whatever the evolution might be. But then he's a small part of a really infinitesimal part, really, of the history of art or the effort to make art. And so I suppose Lascaux was 10 or 15,000 years old, roughly, and it turned out that the painting next to it, which I don't see much difference between the Lascaux paintings and the Chauvet paintings, is about maybe at least 10,000 years older. And so what does it mean that we're so worried about changing our style and being different from everybody when you could paint very successfully for 10 to 15,000 years without making much of a change at all? And it didn't end there. That's Chauvet on the left, and this is the New Yorker cover in 1999. And the same style has managed to survive, although it it's on canvas rather than, it's on a gallery wall rather than being in a cave. Did I go backwards?
No,
that's okay. So now again, courtesy of the Met, and I think that this was the show here of the treasures from Taipei.
1996.
Yeah, 1996. And this is the Emperor Yongle. And why would I pick this painting out? There were a million great paintings in it, but I took this painting because I liked it, for obvious reasons, but also because I was taken with an idea, which I'm not sure is correct, which is that it's likely that this painter was not a true scholar artist. He was more likely to have been a painter, I don't want to say a commissioned hack, but I mean he was a painter at a different level, or it's a different kind of painting, a portrait painter of the emperor than what would be considered a higher level of art. And but the painting in so many ways is a fantastic painting. And so it becomes a question of this is probably more fantastic to a Western eye, perhaps, than some of the more elegant landscapes of the scholar artist. Perhaps. I mean, anyway, I put it that way. And to make it obvious that it was of interest and that I felt some kind of reaction in the sense of resonance, this is Malevich, the yellow quadrilateral. And to me, this is another kind of portrait, although it's a portrait of a quadrilateral, as it turns out. However, so you have the crossover. You have the things that can be together, and you have the things that can be far apart. And I end there. Actually, I just want to show the young Lo Emperor one more time. So, which is what the one advantage that artists have over the art historians, although they also use it. You can be far-fetched at times. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Wang Yongping, who is an internationally respected artist working out of Paris. It's a great privilege to have him here with us today. I thought I would review for some of us in the audience who are less familiar with his career, a little of his background before he talks a little bit about his own oeuvre and we open up the floor for questions. Wang Yongping comes from the coastal province of Fujian, from a town called Xiamen. And so he's not from Beijing or Shanghai. He comes from a port city that was fairly small at the time that he was born there in 1954. So when Frank entered Princeton, Wang Yongping entered the world. And it was from there that he went to suffer through the Cultural Revolution. He was sent down to the countryside. And when he emerged from the countryside, he was successful in matriculating into one of the great art schools of China, the Zhejiang Academy of Art, located in Hangzhou. And for his graduation painting, done in 1981, he took an industrial subject, something you think about the social realist context of his art, except he decided he would use an industrial medium, spray paint, in order to create this image. So it was a very radical step to use an industrial type of medium to create an image that still looks like oil painting, but in fact was already challenging what was the traditional approach to art in the academy at that time. When he returned to Xiamen as a middle school teacher, he became immediately the center of a group of artists who called themselves the Xiamen Dadaists. And Xiamen Dada as a group was radicalized in a way through the access to Western art history and philosophical works that were being translated after a hiatus of more than a decade during the Cultural Revolution. Huang was influenced by Wittgenstein, he was influenced by Marcel Duchamp, and hence the idea of Dada as a concept and as a way of producing art was something that was very much on his mind and influenced this entire group, so that one of their first shows, called introducing themselves as a group, they decided after the exhibition to actually burn the product of their exhibition. Another exhibition that they created in 1986 at the Provincial Museum there was one in which they proposed an exhibit idea that they were sure would be accepted. And then when the day of installation took place, they actually took found objects, construction materials from around the museum, brought it into the museum. When the museum authorities realized what they were doing, they closed the exhibit after 2 hours. So here's a man who's interested in being provocative and interested in challenging the notions of what art can be or should be. And chance plays a very great role in his way of producing art. He wanted to, in some ways, distance himself from the notion that the individual controls the artistic process. So he devised ways by using a roulette-like wheel to direct his artistic production. This is a group of paintings that were produced by him first spinning this wheel and determining from the basis of the wheel how to apply paint to canvas. Perhaps one of his most famous works was created in 1987, and it was to take two very important manuscripts, two important publications on art, Wang Bomin's History of Chinese Painting and Herbert Reed's History of Modern Art, that is Western art, to put them into a washing machine for 2 minutes, and this is the result. So I think it's a way of demonstrating the messy way in which influences through book reading, through exposure to different cultures, through exposure to the past can be mixed up, reinterpreted quite literally, and sometimes in a very messy fashion. That work was shown at a groundbreaking exhibition in Beijing at the National Art Gallery in 1989 called Avant-Garde Art. And it was on the springboard of that exhibit, which also caused a great deal of ferment in the art world in China, that he was invited to be one of 3 Chinese artists to participate in an exhibition called Les Magiciens de la Terre, Magicians of the Land, or Landscape, that was held in Paris at the Pompidou Center. And because this happened in 1989, exactly during the time when the democracy demonstrations were taking place in Tiananmen Square, Wang Yongping actually never returned to China. He remained in Paris, where he's been in residence ever since. He's continued to produce works of art that reflect his interest and engagement with what's happening in China, and the intersection or even collision between the past and the present. In 1997, when Hong Kong was being returned to China after over 100 years of being a colony of Great Britain, he created this exhibition in London in which he took as his model for these enormous ceramic bowls, the Chinese export ware that featured on their surfaces the warehouses of the Western countries that were working out of Canton, where they were storing their produce before it was being exported abroad. So you have images of the flags of the different nations in front of these warehouses, and then he placed inside these bowls produce from Britain, all of which bore a stamp that he created saying the expiration date July 1, 1997, the very day that Hong Kong expired as a British colony and became a part of China. He was highly recognized and regarded in France to the degree that in 1999 he actually participated. He was the featured artist of the Venice Biennale of that year, and the works that he created, One Man and 9 Animals, remains today a permanent installation at the museum in Caen. In the year 2000, in the Shanghai Biennale, he created for the first time, and then subsequently reproduced several times, a model of the Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation's 1923 building on the Bund in Shanghai, created out of sand with a little bit of cement so that over time the building would crumble before your very eyes. So the idea of a work of art not being permanent was very much a part of his thinking here. And I think most compellingly, as an example of this collision between East and West, if you remember around the year 2000, 2001, an American spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter plane over South China, The plane was damaged. It had to land in the region of Huang's hometown. The American government negotiated strenuously to have the spy plane with all of its technology returned. Finally, the Chinese agreed to do so by cutting up the plane. I think it's significant that the plane's insignia was a bat, so obviously it was flying in a stealth-like manner, but was discovered. And Huang has used this notion of fragmentation of the plane as an exhibition that's he's repeated over and over again as part of his work. So I think this gives you some idea of his oeuvre. It was the subject of a major retrospective that was organized by Philippe Verne at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis in 2005 called The House of Oracles. That was a very provocative exhibition that was shown first in Minneapolis, later at the Museum Mass MoCA, and finally back in Beijing in 2000, following the 2005 showing in Minneapolis. Most recently, Mr. Huang was a guest of the Museum of Modern Art here in New York last October when he engaged in a conversation with Jane Debevoise from Asia Art Archive, and much of what I've shown you tonight is indebted to Jane Debevoise's earlier research into Mr. Huang's career. So I think with that brief introduction, let me turn the mic over to Mr. Huang.
.因为刚才也说过这件作品，因为这件作品是关于两本书，就是这两本书，然后这两本书呢，从左边这个是现代艺术史，因为在79年的时候，我还在美院当学生的时候，大概是25岁的时候，就看了这本书，特别是在最后一章呢，是讲到这个抽象表现主义之后，这个里面曾经有6次提到方斯黛拉。这个当然，这本书不但对我，而且对艺术界都很重要。
I should interrupt you long enough to introduce Vincent Chung, who's very kindly agreed to join us this evening to serve as interpreter for Mr. Huang.
Thank you. So we already discussed the work of the washing machine before, so I just want to briefly talk about the 2 books being washed in the washing machine. On the right-hand side is a concise history of modern paintings, and I remember the first time I read this book was when I was a student at the academy. That was 1979. At the time I was 25 years old, and I remember the last chapter is about post-abstract expressionism, and in that chapter Frank Stella's name was mentioned 6 times, so that was the first time I actually learned of this name.
然后另外一本书是关于中国绘画史，其实是专门就是传统的就是。
And the book on the left-hand side is the art history of Chinese painting, mostly the classical Chinese traditional paintings.
这个其实这两本书不单包括了东方、西方，而且包括了这个传统跟现代。
So this is not only a collision of the East and the West, but also the good old day ancient traditional paintings and the modern paintings.
1987年，因为我家正好开始有一部洗衣机，然后我就放在洗衣机里面。然后这个当然是一个，其实我觉得是表明一种姿态，或是表明一种思考方式。
So at the time in 1987, when I did this work, that I happened to have a very, very simple, the first model of washing machine, so I used this as a way to wash those 2 books together. To me, this is it's an expression of an attitude and also a new way of thinking about producing and creating art.
这个是当时的一个草图，就是说明说，比方说我们从洗地可以走到另外的，比如说可以走到脏，就是说从中间出发，可以向各个方向发展。
So this is a draft of the conceptual roadmap, so to speak, that how I developed this particular project. For example, in the middle, you have the word wash, and use free associational words. I branch out from the concept to other concept I think is associated with this idea of washing, and that's the floor plan of this work.
当然89年以后，因为就因为这个马来西亚戴尔这个展览，我到了西方，然后这个整个的这个生活也发生了很大的变化，然后当然作品也会发生很多变化。
So in 1989, since I left China to Paris because of the Musician de la Terre, of course the environment was different, and I had a different way of doing my art as well.
就是从89年以后，我开始发展一种就用2句话来概括，就是以东打西，以西打东。
And starting that point, I used a strategy, what I call use the East to attack the West, and use the West to attack the East.
这句话其实在说明了一个，就是说我希望保持一个他者。
And with this attitude is that I want to remain the other. I'm not part of the East. I'm not part of the West. I am somehow the other.
92年就是我用这个作品叫《占卜者之物》，其实就是用易经来这个参与我的艺术，就是像艺术家就变为一个占卜者这样。
So this is the work I did in 1992 for House of Oracles, in which is I incorporate the Book of Changes from China and use that as a way to present myself as an oracle and as an artist.
然后这个是95年的，这个就是艺术家好像又转变了另外一个角色，好像是一个江湖的一个术士，就是好像因为这是一个葫芦，好像在卖什么药。
So in 1995, I further changed my position and my role from an oracle to a barefoot doctor, and using this as a way as a pharmacist to somehow refine certain medicines that we don't know what's going to come out of that gourd.
这个90年代有一些另外的发展，就是因为我在作品里面用了很多的动物，包括活的动物，特别是昆虫。
Another major theme of the works I did after 1990s will be the incorporation of living animals, including a lot of insects.
就我们看到这个中间的这个，其实是一个有点像微型的一个斗兽场。这个虫在里面扮演一种冲突的一个角色。
So I created a stage almost like a coliseum for animals to fight in.
然后这个桥当然里面有活的龟跟蛇。
And there are snakes and tortoise in this bridge that I created.
这个是95年在旧金山做的一个作品，然后这里面用了200只龟，从这个中国城买到了，但现在这个图像是被还过来，所以这个作品叫 Kenny's Tree， 但是跟这个19世纪的一个排华的一个领袖叫 Kenny， 但有一种谐音，但不是一回事。
So this is a work I did in 1995 in San Francisco. I used the tortoises I purchased in Chinatown, used as including in my artwork. And by the way, this image is actually inside out, so I apologize for that. And the name of this is called Kearney Street. It's the street name of this particular street in San Francisco. And just so that happened, the pronunciation of it, it's very, very similar to the leader of the anti-Chinese movement in 19th centuries, which is Dennis Kearney, I believe.
然后这个是威尼斯双年展华国馆的作品，刚才也说过，这个些动物是在这个华国馆的上空。
So this work we also discussed before, the 1 Man and 9 Animals, and this was in the Venice Biennale, representing the French Pavilion.
这个就从2000以后，我就经常回到中国，就参加各种展览。因为中国这个激烈变化的现实，就有时候就成为我工作的一个主题。
So after year 2000, I started to have a lot of major exhibitions in China, and the reason for that is because I find a lot of inspiration from the fast pace and the fast change, the reality of this fast pace of changes in China, and this is one of the work I did.
因为用沙来象征一种银行，也是一种象征性的。
I use, of course, there's symbolic meanings in terms of using sand as the material and the medium for this particular work.
就这个作品当然就是蝙蝠计划，因为很长，就是一共有4年，我就做过4到5件不一样的作品。因为这件作品主要是关于这个权力跟权力结构，或者说审查，通过审查这个产生的一些反作用，产生新的作品。
This is excuse me. This was the bad project I did, and it actually took a long time in terms of their different reincarnation of this particular project because of censorship, because of cancellation, and so on. So it took 4 years altogether. There are 4 and 5 different versions of this, and I used this particular work to discuss and to examine this idea of power and to construct this idea of power and censorship and the reaction to the censorship, and that's sort of the themes that I discuss and explore in this particular project.
这个近5年来，就是我的作品就很多的就涉及到各方面的，比方说跟宗教有关系，跟政治有关系，跟作品跟这个空间的关系，地点的关系。
So for the past 5 years, I've been exploring different themes, including religions, politics, including the relationship between the artwork and the space, the artwork and the location.
这个是一个西藏的转经筒，在一个这个塔上啊。
So this is installations I did.
在一个
It's a Tibetan prayer wheels in a tower.
在西藏，所以这个
西藏转经筒。
西藏有关系。
这个作品是在纽约，是在巴巴格拉斯顿画廊。这个作品是跟另外一个作品，这个从西到 B， 那西就是斗兽场，那 B 就是五角大的。
So this is a work called From C to P, and this is a work I did here in New York, and C stands for Colosseum, and P stands for the Pentagon.
这个都是一些关于时间跟大自然的这个变迁，还有一些权力的转移的一些想法。
So it's about the passage of time and the change of powers.
因为这个东西可能是一个盆景。
So this is a miniature of those 2 buildings. At the same time, also a bonsai flower pot.
这是2009年在这个巴黎的一个作品，叫《方舟》。其实是这个让人联想到这罗马方舟。
So this is a work I did in 2009. It will remind people of the Noah's Ark.
但这个方舟呢，其实是用纸张做的这个船，然后中间呢又有一些烧焦的这个动物，就是说这个动物好像逃过了这个洪水，但免不了又惹来了这个火灾。
So the whole ark is actually made of paper, and the animals inside actually they're burned. So what I'm trying to say here is that they might be able to escape the flood, but they cannot escape the fire afterward.
这个背景是巴黎美院小教堂。
So this is inside a small chapel.
在哪里？巴黎美院的小教堂。
In the French Academy of Fine Art. Paris.
这是摩纳哥的一个作品，叫《乌贼》。
So this is a work in Monaco called 乌贼。
在海洋博物馆。
It's in the Oceanic Museum.
因为乌贼这个从中文角度来说，乌就是黑，贼就是小偷，其实就是像木鱼，因为木鱼经常有个习惯，它是装死浮在水上，然后鸟一在上面，它就抓起来。
So the name Wu Zei, and the literal translation is Wu stands for black or dirty, and Zei means thief. So for me, this is sort of a metaphor and a symbols to talk about this idea of the octopus or the squid. They will play dead and floating on the water, and so when the birds are actually resting on them, they then capture them and devour them.
这个是最近的一件作品，可能就是在北京唐人画廊。
So this is the latest work exhibited in the Tang Museum Art Gallery in China.
因 因为有一个题目是就是列维坦兄，就是说这个就把两个词合在一起。
So I'm combining the story from Old Testament, the Leviathan, with the word nation. So the word is called Leviathan nation.
这个是这个上面有一些动物的头，一个鱼头上面有很多的动物头。
So on top of that big fish head, you have other heads of animals attached to it.
后面是一个毛的专业的一个半截。
And following that is a half portion of this particular so-called mouse train that exclusively used by Mao Zedong at the time. This is a replica, of course.
这个是关于巨兽、巨人、国家、机器的一种混合物。
So it's a combination of giant monsters and historical giants and nations and machines.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I have a question.
Gary.
It strikes me that at the beginning of both of your careers, Mr. Hong and Mr. Stella, that on the one hand, there's an act of renunciation or of destruction. In the case of the washing machine, it's a destructive act. And it seems that you're making a comment about the dominant practice of artists in China at that time, which would have been a kind of academic realism or a social realism that was promoted by official circles in China. Frank Stella, in '58, when you abandoned your painterly abstraction of 58, 57, 58, and made these very severe black paintings, that too was a kind of renunciation of both what you had just learned to do, but also what was the dominant practice in your community. And I wondered how important was it for both of you at those moments in your career to make a dramatically different statement? Because in the case of Mr. Huang, although it was different from the dominant practice in China, the Duchampian act already was a kind of tradition, certainly in the West. And for Frank Stella, although his black paintings were very different from what he had just done and what was dominant in New York, there were affinities, of course, with Russian constructivism and other moments in the history of art with which you were familiar. And I just wondered how important was novelty and originality to you as artists at the beginning of your career?
Well, not much, because it's a discussable idea now, but at the time when you're doing it, I had no ideas about anything except what I was making and whether or not I liked it. And it's the question of how it looks to you when you're immersed in it. And so the black paintings, that one in particular actually, but anyway, the paintings that were colorful and then became black in an obvious way. I made a painting that wasn't working so well, and I painted it out black. And then I went to sleep. And then, when I got up in the morning, it looked kind of interesting. And that started me thinking about it.
So there was no premeditated moment. I mean, there was no decision on your part, I have to do something different from what everyone else is doing around me.
No, I have to do something, hopefully, as good as what they do. Because it's a kind of, well, I don't know if I want to call it hero worship and everything, but the idea is that you want to be like in some way at a level of the art that you admire. I mean, I know it's horrible to use sports analogies and things like that, but, you know, if you admire the game of baseball, you want to be able to hit a 94-mile-an-hour fastball, and that's your goal. So you work at it the best you can.
我是觉得这个反叛，我觉得是特别在当代性里面就很明显。我可以打个比方，如果是在19世纪，如果是我是一个中国画家的话，我可能不可能采取这种方式，是吧？因为这个就要从当个徒弟开始，然后慢慢经过很长的时间。所以像中国的传统，它是一个延续非常长的一个，它不存在断裂，但现代充满了断裂。
So to me, I do think that subversion or being able to be able to challenge the mainstream art practice, it is the quintessential spirit of contemporary art. If I were to be born in the 19th century, I don't think I would use the exact same approach to my art. I probably will be just like everyone else, to be the disciple of masters, spend a long time to perfect my techniques. So I do think that this is something coming out of the historical context, and I do think that in the past you do have this continuity, whereas here, when we talk about contemporary art, it's all about dismantling that continuity.
但这个东西，我觉得断裂当然也是看每个人的这个角度来看不一样，因为其实我们说的断裂，就是还是逃不了，就是跟传统有一定的关系，是吧？不是跟比较远的传统，也是跟比较近的传统，因为一个人不可能从彻底上离开这个地面。
So in terms of speaking of these breaks that is so important for contemporary art, definitely I do think that it also has to put in context. Not only you are breaking from the tradition in terms of in the past, but also you are breaking from what's happening right now in the contemporary world, because you want to distinguish yourself from other artists.
I was struck by the fact that both artists are clearly well educated. They come from an academic background where you were exposed to masterpieces from the past. So Caravaggio was something that you both responded to, and at the same time wanted to, can't say reject, but at least the fact that that was the canon of the time, that you said, I can't duplicate that, I have to find it my own way, was obviously very important. And I think in Mr. Huang's case as well, the fact that he was given a traditional education was very important, but clearly the impetus to destroy or to reinvent where he was just as strong. So I think in both cases I see the need to reject at least the academic background. And in fact, taking the books and destroying them in a washing machine, it couldn't be a more vivid example of taking your academic training and saying, this is a pile of rubbish, or there's something to be gained by throwing these things together and seeing what happens.
Well, I think that there's plenty of obvious truth in that. But one of the things is that from another educational point of view, which was the academic one in which I was either born into or brought up, doesn't matter. But in the academic tradition, I was lucky enough to experience, I was able to experience art, or learn about art and art history. And when I left the university, which I was told there was the possibility that I would continue my interest in art. The obvious thing would be to go to art school. But the advice that I got was unanimous. Don't go to art school. So it was a question of doing what you were doing and go someplace, which wasn't far from where I was 35 miles to New York City, and continued to work. So the idea was that there was no, the only training that I had was the experience that I had of making paintings with mentors and teachers, which I had in high school and the university, who were very encouraging and very good. But then there was no level of professional instruction or engagement available. The next step was to play the game. And I might add one thing that seems a little bit like a non sequitur, but actually things change. You make a certain kind of paintings, and then I made those paintings that were black. But after that, I did change by thinking about the geometry and thinking about the paintings and thinking about the surface. And I remembered about Pollock, or I'd seen it in the painting. But anyway, the notion, and there was a paint store near my studio, was thinking about aluminum paint and metallic paint. And that's, if you use a lot of it, it's a pretty untraditional medium. And by making geometric paintings with aluminum paint only, and so just the aluminum paint into the raw canvas, I made something that I didn't expect, or, it changed. It seems funny, but they were very different from the black paintings in every way. And that was probably a change towards, or in the direction that the black paintings are always given credit for. And the only way I can explain that is that I was chosen to be in an exhibition by Adolf Gottlieb. He chose one of the black paintings and put it in a show in Art Academy, or there's on 23rd Street, I can't remember. And it was nice to show, and other artists had picked younger artists. And then a year later, I had the show of the aluminum paintings. And Ivan Karp told me that Adolf Gottlieb had come into the gallery to look at the pieces, and had walked in and looked at the aluminum paintings and everything, and turned right around and went right out like a rocket. And obviously he was very disappointed. It wasn't what he expected. And he was probably right, I mean, about that part.
这个，因为我跟黄斯德拉都是美院毕业，但是我想，这个背景有很大的不一样，特别是在70年代末，这个中国的这个学院还是很保守。比方说，我刚刚说的那本书，这个没有一个老师会去指导你怎么来看，比如说来跟你谈这个70年代到底发生了什么事情，没有的，是吧？而且像这种书的出版前面都有一篇很长的批判文章。 叫你说你看看就好，你不要把这个事情当作真的，你可以批判它。
So, even though that we both share something common, which is that we came from the academic system or the academies, but at the same time, I think that we're coming from a very, very different backgrounds. For example, when I was a student in the academy, that was the end of the 1970s. At the time, it was still very, very conservative. The book that I mentioned to you before, the teachers actually somehow they didn't even bother to instruct you on how to make sense of that particular history, and also before the preface of these books will actually have some kind of critics or criticism of criticizing the content that you're about to read, and as almost like a disclaimer for all students. So definitely at the time it was still very, very conservative.
对，所以在这种背景里面，就是可能会反叛性特别强，这个就完全跟这背景完全是唱反调。
So against this particular background, of course, that will make us students become very, very rebellious and really want to somehow subvert and also create something more subversive.
但是像这个两本书放在洗衣机里面，这个当然也是一个，其实也是个悖论。为什么？其实这两本书对我来说非常重要，对，就是说，整个的这个了解都在里面。 但是呢，为什么要把它扔进去？其实就是一个矛盾的一个做法。
So to me, actually, it's quite contradictory in a way. I feel very conflicted because these are very, very important books to me. But I also want to use a way of putting it in washing machine to somehow dismantle them at the same time. So it's sort of love-hate relationship I had.
Well, the academy here is perhaps more insidious. Maybe. The only point I want to offer is that it's true that when I moved from the normal academy or normal level of education, I was in an environment where anything goes, and so that's it. There you have the restriction. You're bound by complete freedom to do anything you want.
But so many artists of your generation, or I would say so many artists who were coming of age in New York in the late 50s and early 60s, like a Sol LeWitt or Richard Serra, and we have an exhibition of Richard Serra's work here. It seemed that you responded to this anything goes freedom by making a set of constraints for yourself, that you would decide, I'm going to do this way, I'm going to do this act this many times in this direction on this day, and in a sense saying it doesn't really matter what the result is. If I take this line and I slice it here, and if I take that line and I bifurcate it there, that you're creating a set of almost arbitrary propositions that don't necessarily anticipate an aesthetic or visual result. And yet, what we all admire as viewers and what we display in the museums, of course, are these aestheticized objects, which are there for the observer to encounter and to react, sometimes intellectually, often emotionally and intuitively to them. And so I think it's just so interesting that you, on the one hand, had complete freedom, then you make a set of rules for yourselves, you operate, in a sense, in this procedural way, saying, I'm not really thinking about the result, I'm just thinking about my action at this moment. But then in the end, you're left with the result, and then you decide to keep it, or to destroy it, to throw it away, to exhibit it, to sell it. And I'm struck, especially in the Richard Serra exhibition, but also in your work, Frank, at that disconnect between the initial process, the set of propositions, and the result, which in the end is indeed aesthetic. Can you elucidate on that?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, you have to like what you do, and then try to you have to deal with it, which is to make something and then put it or reach a level where you can let go of it, where you think it's worth having done it. But having said that, I mean, there's a process here of another kind of, when I first came to New York, the worst kind of artist you could be was an academic artist. And by that they meant usually, I take the words of Clifford Still, a Bauhaus-type artist. I suppose for Clifford Still, the worst artist in the world was probably Joseph Albers. But it broke down in kind of simple ways. But it was still free. I mean, and the system was about experiencing and learning. It was about what you made and what other people made. And it was a good time, certainly in the 60s, in which, the New York is a hub. I mean, there was a lot of activity here. And the only point I like to make about New York and what's available to people who are interested in making art is that you have a system. The museums now charge admission, which is bad for them, but the galleries are still free. so that if you come here and if you're an artist, you can see what the artists you're interested in are doing, and you can see it pretty much when they do it. Nothing, what's going on is available to you, and much in the way that, say, in something as obvious as scholarship or science, things are published right away in the journal, so the work is there. If you want it, you can have access to it.
I've been struck, I love your comment about seeing that aluminum paint in the Pollock, and from that leaping to the use of aluminum paint in your own very structured work. And it reminded me of when I thought about some of Bryce Martin's work, for example, that he took inspiration from printed calligraphy to create his own Cold Mountain series. And it was very clear in talking to Bryce about that the artist doesn't always have to understand the sources of inspiration. To start with an idea, you see what you want, and you take something and make it into your own. And I think that's very much the case with Wang Yongping's art as well, that he's actually commented that I didn't really understand what Duchamp was saying. I'm not sure I understand what he was saying either. But the point is that I could take inspiration from that. And just as we were about to walk on stage, he made this wonderful comment. He said, 乱是创造的开始. He said, chaos is where creativity begins. So this idea that I thought when you put the Caravaggio on the screen, you were going to say, this is really was an inspiration for my painting where it projects off the wall.
Yeah, that's what everybody said after the fact.
But the fact
that's what
that
they wanted it to be.
Right. But you have the portrait of the Yongle Emperor. So I'm not sure what you took away from that painting, but it's very clear that artists have this wonderful ability to pick and choose the sources of their inspiration, and then what you do with it is very much your own. And does that involve, in your case, Frank, the same sort of acceptance that there's a kind of chaotic process to this, that it could be happenstance? I painted my canvas black because I wasn't happy with it. I woke up the next morning and I said, I like it. I thought that was, I think these kinds of moments of inspiration are very important, and clearly in Wang Yongping's work there is a great deal of inspiration drawing from traditional Chinese culture, but it is completely revamping it, reworking it. So how much of that process is conscious, how much is subconscious?
Well, I like to think it's all conscious. And I'm not sure why, but for example, as much loving Caravaggio or loving the art of the past or loving the art of my own time or the artists that I like, that I grew up with and everything, I mean, I like the work that they make, but more than anything, you know, I'm looking here. I look as much as I can at everything. But most of all, I'm looking for a good idea.
Yeah.
And sometimes I see it, and I can't use it, actually. And sometimes I see things that are usable. But, you know, the thing is, there's never a panacea, unfortunately.
对我来说，就是像传统，比如说这个中国的绘画传统，其实对我的这个影响是很少，因为我很少从里面得到启发。但是呢，我从其他的那个传统，比方说可能是思想的传统，比方说或者说再变一点，比如说这个巫术的传统啊，或者说民间的传统，就是不是直接跟这个艺术有直接关系的，可能是有一些间接关系的。这样对我更多的启发。
To me, I think the inspiration actually comes very, very little from the so-called Chinese painting traditions. To me, other things that indirectly related to art, actually give me a lot of inspirations, including thoughts, philosophies, witchcrafts, folklore. These are the things that actually inspire more and more than the so-called traditional Chinese painting.
有一段时间我就不看美学的书，就当然 这个展览也看的不是很多，但是我更关心一些就好像表面上跟艺术没有关系的东西，那这个从这里面可以转换为这个跟艺术有关。
And at one point, I actually chose not to read any type of art magazines or art publications or any type of exhibitions, just to stay away from, maintain a healthy distance from it. And to me, I really want to find inspiration from things that seemingly unrelated to art, and I think that really give me a wealth of inspiration for my work.
我觉得艺术家对传统的这个接受都是很自由的，都是很个人化的。这个有时候很难说从学校里面可以得到，或者说都是一些比较特殊的一些途径。
So in terms of this type of tradition that we inherit, I think that it really depends on the person. It's on case by it depends on you and depends on your environment and how you see your academic learning. So I do think that this is very highly subjective.
Are there any artists who are practicing in either China or in the West today that you feel are a source of inspiration for your work?
对于在西方或在东方这样的现在的一些艺术家，对你来说有哪些人对你是很大的启发？
当然就是说，我觉得企划肯定有存在的，但是呢，就是因为我有一个习惯，我觉得这个习惯当然可能不是太好，登了这个楼梯以后就把这个梯子给扔掉了，是吧？这个就也不太尊重。但是这个是创作的一个必然。
Definitely, I'm inspired by a lot of people came before me and a lot of masters and artists. But at the same time, I have to admit that I have certain habit, and probably very bad habit is that I tend to burn my bridges. So I will use their ideas or somehow get inspired by that, and then I will move on.
Thank you. 谢谢.
Shall we open up questions to the audience, Matt?
Please.
Yeah.
I think we have a microphone. If you could stand up and speak.
I have a question for each of you, Mr. Huang Yongping. You've been an artist and lived through a period of incredible economic transformation that occurred in China over the same time as you've had your career. And at the same time, Chinese art has become so important in not just your part of the world or China, but also in our part of the world in the West. How does it feel to have come from where you were and be one of the best or the most acclaimed artists of your generation? And how has that proximity to collectors and the whole world of collecting affected your art, or has it not affected your art at all? And to Mr. Stella, my question is, you showed the painting of Caravaggio's. Is that painting reality to you? And if it's not, what is it?
您问题说，就是你在个人的这种艺术发展的时候，刚好是在中国的经济发展变革最强烈的时候，那你刚好那个时候你已经离开了到法国去，那你觉得说这样有什么样的感觉？在走出了之后，发现这个中国美术现在已经就是在艺术市场变得这么的发展，这么活跃。另外一方面就是说，你自己觉得说到了巴黎之后，对于这些收藏人这么多的这样的环境啊，对你的艺术作品有什么样的影响？有影响吗？还是有的话是什么样的影响？
这个我当然就是我没有赶上这个中国的这个经济的热潮，但这个也是个好事，我觉得这个因为这个热潮也造成了一些反面的东西，这个当然，但就我个人来说，这当然会碰到这个收藏的问题，但收藏的问题对我来说，其实也是最近10年以后才出现的。这个很多的情况，比如说我很多的作品在到法国以后，也是做了以后就扔掉了，就没法收，而且也太大了，就当垃圾了，就很多的是 FMA，就是一个瞬间的。
I definitely felt that, I felt a little let out. I left right at the point of this new trend of emerging interest in Chinese art, but at the same time, I do see that this is almost something that is lucky in a way that I didn't get on that particular trend just because I do see there are a lot of negative drawbacks of this particular hype, this particular trend that's currently happening in China. In terms of the collecting, I do see in the past 10 years, actually, I did a lot of works that are so huge and so uncollectible. Actually, they turn into garbage after at the end, and so yeah, that's what's happening with most of my work. Actually, is something that I destroy afterwards, or just I threw them out.
但我不知道有没有回答他的问题。
But I'm not sure whether or not I actually answer your question.
No, I was just wondering if the reason that the work gets thrown out, if we can't blame that on the museums for encouraging installation art so much. They don't want to, they want to exhibit it, and they'll pay the artist to make it and exhibit it, but they don't want to collect it.
Storage is a huge problem.
他的问题就是，是不是博物馆是犯错误？就是他们愿意由你做这个 installation，就是不愿意收藏，所以是不是有一点矛盾吧？
我觉得这个对是有矛盾，但是其实收藏是很多的情况下是要等到就是你有就是在社会上或是说人家会承认的他才收，否则他就觉得这个跟垃圾没有什么两样。当这艺术跟这个跟垃圾好像这个界限好像是移动的，一会儿变为垃圾，一会儿变为可收藏东西，这个怎么回事？
So I definitely think that there's a contradiction, of course, but at the same time, I do think the act of collecting really depends on whether or not, as an artist, you are recognized as an artist. There's a very, very thin line between art and garbage. It can go either way, very easily.
Frank had a question also about Caravaggio and whether it's reality or if
Right,
not
I
reality,
wanted-
what is it?
Right, I wanted to dodge that because the issue of reality comes up because in mimetic or representational art, it's how real it looks. But the problem with that is it raises an issue about painting that's a nightmare, which is illusion. And there's no way around it one way or the other. And the other side of it, the other side of the coin in our time has become literalism. And I don't want to talk about illusionism and literalism no matter what anymore.
I'm actually an art student from mainland China. 我刚好也是从大陆来的一个艺术学生。So I have two questions, one for Mr. Stella and one for Mr. Huang. 我有一个问题，一个给黄老师您，一个是给Mr. Stella. The first question that I have for Mr. Stella is, from your lecture, I feel like somehow the way you work is, you just go for it, and I feel like it's come from your instinct. Is there any time or any period that you got stuck, or you just think a lot about your work?
Well, you get stuck, there's no question, but there's two ways of getting stuck. One, you start repeating yourself so much that you can't bear it. And then, and the other way is that you start on things and you get into to give it a fancy name, the Leonardo syndrome. And you start working on things that are unrealizable because you don't know how to do it, or it's a bad idea, or whatever it is, and you spend a lot of time convincing yourself that you're going to work your way through it. So you can either repeat yourself or work your way through a lot of unworkable ideas, and that eats up the time in between the things that you do that work out well.
Cool, thank you. For Mr. Huang, 黄老师。从你的作品，我觉得往往就是有一些非常深的想法在背后，所以我想问，就是当您在创作作品的时候，您是想法是就是你的那些主意是直接到你的脑子里，还是说你是通过很长时间的思考？From your work, I think sometimes there's a lot of thought behind it, and So my question is, when you start to do your work, is the idea just came to you, or you think a lot before you start working?
这个当然是不能一一而论。当然有时候作品会就是突然间，这个也不是所有作品都需要有一个很深的这个想法，而且就是说你有很深的想法，其实到头来还不是都是一些很简单的东西，是吧？这个当然我也回答刚才就是其实是那个 Stella 的问题。其实艺术家的就是说艺术家的想法跟他的这个日常生活或者说这个生命呢是不是一个同步的东西啊？有可能经常有这种情况，就是关于这个想法的它的质疑的这个发展，可能是另外一条路子，生命的发展又是另外一条路子，不知道有没有说清楚。
So first we'll answer my question, which is that I really cannot give you a simplistic answer to this because it really depends on the work that I'm involved in. For some works, actually does not really require a lot of thoughts into it. And sometimes certain works I actually put a lot of efforts and think a lot about it, but at the same time, the end result is something that just came out very, it's a very simplistic work without any, it doesn't involve a lot of thoughts for the audience to understand. So it's hard to describe how this idea came to me or something that actually put a lot of thought into it. In terms of the questions that you ask Frank Stella, I do think that you definitely have sort of this parallel realities that you're living in terms of your creative life and your daily life that you live in. So I do think that in terms of concept, in terms of ideas, I think that you might follow a certain path, but the way that you live and the way you create as an artist might be something completely different. So I really see this as something separate.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for both coming. And I guess as an artist that has yet to be discovered, that would be me. I was wondering, Frank, if after you realized you were on your way and with gallery representation and you felt at that moment when that happened, things started gelling and I guess I was just kind of wondering if you had any sort of pressure as an artist to think of what will be the next thing. You know, what do I do next? If there was any pressure on you, and then the next question is what came of that.
Well, I mean, it seems silly to talk about it, but I mean, when the black paintings were shown, they were shown at the Museum of Modern Art, which obviously got them a lot of attention. But 9 out of 10 people said, "Oh well, it's over. They're black. There's nowhere to go." And one of those people was Margaret Scolari Barr. But hopefully most of you won't know who that was. So no, there's pressure, but it's not the pressure is always described in essentially abstract terms, because for the artist, I mean, it's simply, there's just a lot more pressure than that kind of pressure, which is the pressure to actually make the work and make it in a way that you feel first, not really something more than comfortable. I mean, something that you feel together with, or close to, or something that's, it's not a nice way to say it, but, part of you, but it's a part of you you want to get rid of, but so that you can find other parts of yourself that you believe will be better or more interesting. But you can't, it's still one way or the other. People like to call it a career, but I mean, really, it's a job, and it's not any more glamorous than any other job.
I also wanted to tell you, I'm not a big fan of Caravaggio, and after I graduated, they told me to go to school, to keep going. So I just, opposite of what you've been told, they told me to keep going. But my question to Wang Yongping is just a quick one. I just wanted to know if your reaction to the Ai Weiwei installation in Manhattan right now. So, thank you.
在曼哈顿的这样的一个装置艺术，你对它有什么感觉？
这个装置我没看，因为我昨天晚上才来，这个也没有去看，所以也就没有看就没有发言权。
So I actually arrived.
我听说。
So I arrived yesterday, so I didn't have the chance to actually see this installation. So it's hard for me to say something about it, but I actually heard about it before.
对，但是其实艺术家对艺术家的这个评价就评论其实不重要，是吧？这个艺术家经常说，哎呀，这个，反正这个都不重要，是吧？
So I don't think that it's very important in terms of how you evaluate or how you talk about and somehow critique someone's work. I don't think that's the most important aspect.
对。
Well, specifically for one artist to comment on another artist's work is not necessarily fruitful.
Well, perhaps, we have two more questions. I was going to say that was a great note to end on, but let's take these last two questions quickly.
Yeah, I'll just keep this short. I was really intrigued by the first slide the artist put on. I don't know if you talked before the conversation today, but it just occurred to me that Mr. Stella put on Caravaggio, which is art, and Huang Laoshi put on, he's really anti-art work, which at the very beginning of his career, he was thinking about discourses. And throughout tonight's conversation, I noticed that both of you are kind of evasive of commenting on each other's work. Could it be that you regard each other's strategies as irrelevant, or do you really have something to say? 所以我的问题就是我翻译给黄老师听了，我就是说，我看你们就是你们放上来的第一个那个 slide 特别有意思，因为Stella 先生放上的是卡拉瓦乔的那个画，但是你放的就是一个本身很反艺术的一个作品。所以我想听听你们两个对彼此的这个策略有什么看法，如果有看法的话。Thank you.
I don't care. I don't find it a difficult question. Commenting on other artists' work depends on where or what the comments are intended to do. Most of the comments that or questions that I used to get when I was once a younger artist in New York, the collectors were always, when you'd go to a gallery or something, they were always all over you about what do you think about Larry Poons or John Chamberlain or this, that, and the other. And all they wanted was your take on them for whether or not they thought it was a good idea. They're comparing notes about their purchases or what they're going to do. And the best answer to that I ever heard was David Hockney and a guy came up to him and said, well, who do you think the best artist of the 60s is or was and everything? And David looked at him and said, Picasso, of course.
要不要回答这个问题吗？
他已经回答得很好。
You already gave a very appropriate and very good answer for that.
From this conversation, it's become apparent that there is a spirit of renunciation, this rejection of the past and the mainstream. Do you feel a need to defend your work as you progress from becoming an academic artifact, or is that something that you would want? In other words, how old do you intend your pieces to be?
But while they're talking, can I interrupt?
Yeah, go ahead.
The issue about other artists and talking about their work and everything, it's presuming that you have something to say, which you may not. But the main thing is there's a presumption of opinion or criticism. And the problem with that is, why are you asking the question? Because by and large, most artists that I know and most artists that I've experienced are making art because they're interested in it, and they're interested in the work of the other artists and how they make it and what they do and what they think about it. And I guess I'm going to have to come up with another Picasso story, one last one. But anyway, Picasso's at a flea market, and they're going by, and then they're on to, I presume, a quite nice restaurant. And he stops and he buys this pitiful little painting. And his friends say to him, what do you need with that? That's one of the worst paintings I've ever seen. And Picasso says, if I don't love it, who will? And I think that that's true about the artists and their relationship with each other. I mean, you know, the matchbook covers and the things, you know, how bad can a painting be? Well, a lot of artists ask that question in a very sophisticated way, but in a very conventional way, how bad it can be, you know, it's never that bad. It always gets kind of interesting. If it's really bad and really, you know, essentially kind of naive in a way, and the people, everybody has a kind of control and a way of presenting things because they're making art. And it's tricky about how unsophisticated artists make art, and it's very tricky about how people who are considered, you know, unhealthy in one way or another, psychically, make art. All of those things are problems, but they still have a way of arresting your attention.
那比方说，我今天这个也在画廊走了一下，我也看到还有展览毕加索的东西。我觉得毕加索的东西确实它变化也很大，是吧？这个他自己也觉得他一直在变化，一直变化。但是有一些人看可能都是一样的，所以我们对一样或者变化都有每个人的看法，尺度也不一样。
So today, actually, I was in the galleries and I saw quite a few Picasso's paintings, and I do see that there are a lot of changes around different period of his career. But for a lot of people, they think that they are all the same. So I do think that this idea of sameness, this idea of changes, actually is very subjective.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think tonight I would just like to explain for the audience the reason we invited Mr. Wang and Mr. Stella was not because they had two similar practices, but because they had two very distinct and different practices. And yet, I think what we've heard tonight is that artists, and I think we can extrapolate throughout history, often grapple with similar issues when they're alone in their studio, in their workroom, wanting to do something, in the case of Mr. Huang, or to make something, in the case of Frank Stella, that will communicate to some observer, real or imaginary. So I hope that you've all enjoyed this program with these two remarkable artists, each so varied in their approach, but so compelling with what they make. Thank you all very, very much.